You're going to get a test. Sorry, you're going to get a test question, and it's going to give you a whole bunch of information. And then at the end, the question's going to want to know, how much does your buyer have to bring to closing? And that's where we are right now. That's where we are tonight, at least for the first part of tonight. And that is the end of 21. So before we look at that math, there's a couple other things that we need to talk about, make sure that we have an understanding. So we know what it is we're looking at. You guys have already seen this. This is where we left on Thursday. So you already have this information down. Again, this is new book, people. But this is the different, this is your resource slide, we'll call it. This is the different places in the book that you can find what you need to do the settlement statement math. As mentioned, the test question is just going to ask what your buyer has to bring to closing. I call these mini CDs because we're not doing a full-blown settlement statement. You won't do a full-blown settlement statement until you come see me in post licensing. So for right now, we're just easing you into it. And we're just going to do a mini CD. Question comes in, how long do we have to access the online learning system after the class is over? Lane will leave you guys up for 4 months. If you need it for longer, just reach out to her. If you need it for more than 4 months, just shoot her a message and she'll be happy to do it. Again, that's our objective, is to get you guys through the state exam. So we're going to provide you with the material you need to get through that. So with this mini CD, I'm going to say this. It is a lot of work for one test question. It's only one test question, which means you only get 1 point. And it's a lot of work. So before we look into what all this means, let's talk about some test taking strategies. When you guys sit down to do both my exam and your state exam, I always want you to bookmark the math and save it for last. Always, always. Because the math is what's going to take you the longest. So save it for last. So if you come across a question and all 4 answer choices are numbers, don't even read it. Just bookmark it and move on. The last thing you'll do is the math, because that's what's going to take you the longest. And then you know how much time you have to devote to that. Of all the math, I want you to do the mini CD last. So what I'm suggesting, what I'm recommending is the very last thing you do before you hit submit is this mini CD. Because how many points is it? Yeah, just 1. So I certainly don't want to downgrade the importance of this math. This math is so important. And we'll talk about why in just a second. I don't want to downgrade it at all. But I also need you guys to keep half an eye on that clock while you're taking these exams. And we need to know how we can help kind of strategize through this. I also am saying this is a lot of work. This is a lot of work. And some of you, it's been my experience, some of you may say to yourself, this is only one test question. I'm not going to worry about it now. I'm just going to wait and figure this out when I get my license. If that's your strategy, that's fine. But hear me, you're going to have to learn it at some point. If you're not trying it now, then you're going to have to learn it when you're out in the real world with an actual buyer and an actual seller. Yes, you'll have BICs and you'll have peers to help you. But if you go into the real world without even trying this, it's going to be a lot harder. At some point, your BIC may look at you and say, did they cover this in pre-licensing? And none of you can say no, even if you chose not to do it, because we are and we do, because it is that important. So you guys do with this what you will. Like I said, it's just one test question. I think the last thing I have to say is, not to sound, but I don't want to hear it because when I got my license back in 2008, we had to do a full-blown settlement statement. And it was 4 test questions just on this one CD. Somewhere between 2008 and the time I started teaching in like 2017, something like that, they cut that back. They scaled that back for you guys for a mini CD. And then they kept the full-blown one for post-licensing. I'm just going to say, when I started teaching, I found that out. I was mad. I'm like, are you kidding me? That's not fair. You guys have a really good advantage because they're not expecting you to do the full blown CD yet. They've scaled it back to that mini CD. So, with that being said, we're here again. This is kind of your resource slide, so you know where to find this information that we're getting ready to talk about. Do I have any questions or comments before we get started?
Julie,
Yeah,
I suspect that there is no standardized settlement statement. Am I correct?
absolutely. Because there is no transaction that's the same as any other transaction before. So the what is involved, the numbers, the people, and that's a great point, Roderick. Thank you for bringing that up. Um, one of the one of the beauties of real estate, once you go out and do your very first transaction, you will never do a transaction like that one before. When you go out and do your 30th and 50th, you still haven't done them all. Consider this, you guys. Every property, every buyer, and every seller are different, and the combination of those three make for a unique transaction every single time. So there is no standardized. And to that point, this is definitely where you guys are going to hear me emphasize: do what the problem tells you. The problem is this transaction, and that's all you guys care about. So if the problem doesn't tell you to do, for example, excise tax, then don't worry about excise tax. Just do what the problem tells you, because that helps you get through this problem, this transaction. So let's talk about some things before we pick up our calculators. When we do these, we're only dealing with debits and credits. Debit is money going out. It's something that the buyer or seller owes. It's money that they have to pay. A credit then is money coming in. Either money's coming in from one party to the other. Maybe a credit is money coming in on your behalf. I always think of debits and credits. Like if we go to the store tomorrow and you swipe your card at the cash register, how does that show up on your bank statement? That shows up as a debit. Yeah, money going out, right? You get paid on Friday. They do direct deposit. How does that show up on your bank statement? That shows up as a credit, money coming in. So it's either money going out, money that you owe somebody or something, or it's money coming in on your behalf. So we're going to break down debits and credits for buyers and sellers in just a bit. Before we do that, though, we have danced all around prorating. So here's your official introduction to proration. If you are prorating something, you are just taking a shared expense and making it fair between the parties. So the example, we've got a few other prorating things that we might see, but the example that we use, the one that we've been talking about thus far, probably because it is the most common one, is this year's property taxes. If you're buying my house at any time this year, neither one of us own the house for the entire year. So it's not fair for either one of us to pay the full year's taxes. Can we all agree that this year's taxes would be a shared expense? I have some responsibility in this year's taxes, and you have some responsibility in this year's taxes. So how are we gonna handle this? We're gonna take that shared expense and we're going to make it fair. And that's what prorating does. And again, I got a couple other examples, but this year's annual taxes are one of the better examples that we see that we prorate. Both parties have an interest in the property this year. So we're going to take a shared expense and make it fair. We're going to prorate it. So let's talk real quick You have annual taxes, and you need to make those annual taxes. You need to turn those annual taxes into monthly taxes. What are we going to do? How are we going to make that happen? They give you annual taxes, and we need to figure out monthly. I got you guys slashing.
Divided by 12.
Does that mean divide by 12? Yeah. So you take this annual taxes and you divide by 12, and that gives us monthly. What if we want to make our annual taxes daily? Now we got to talk about how many days in a year, and what is going to make pre-licensing fun this year is it happens to be a leap year. But in pre-licensing world, it's not a leap year because I'm not updating all those problems just for 1 year, just to go back next year and redo them again. So we're not going to, everybody pretend that we're not in a leap year. We're going to talk about days in a second, but calendar days. How many calendar days are in the year? 365. So if they give you annual and they want to break you down to daily, how do we do that? We slashing it again by 365. The other scenario they may give you is they may do a 30, every month has 30 days. 30 times 12 is 360. Again, I'm going to talk more about that in just a second, but for right now, I need everybody to understand the problem will have to tell you what kind of calendar we're dealing with. Are we dealing with an official calendar? Or are we dealing with a 30-month, 360 days? You guys have your calculators or your phones handy? Has everybody been calculator shopping yet? Please go. Perfect. Perfect. So I'm going to give you guys just a second. We're going to kind of do a refresher from Unit 3. Remember in Unit 3, we first had to find the annual taxes. And then I'm going to give you guys the opportunity to take that a step further and tell me what the daily taxes are using the 360-day year. Set your chats to private. Let's go ahead and do that now. Because I know when we get an answer, we get excited and we forget to do it. So let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and set it for private now. And in a private chat, take just a minute and tell me what are the daily taxes owed on this property. About 30 more seconds, then we'll talk about it. Hit close to home, didn't it? Okay. So what do we do first? Just read. Read and breathe, breathe and read. A property is located in Davie County, subject to ad valorem tax of 80 cents per $100 of value. Property's assessed tax value is 172,000. I'm sorry, 172,500. Using a 360-day year, what are the daily property taxes owed on this home? So the first thing we need to do is our refresher from Unit 3, where we need to find the annual taxes. Remember your formulas. The formula allows you to solve for annual taxes. We can't argue with the formula. So the first thing we need to do is to find annual taxes, which in T-bar world is that number on top. I know my annual taxes are part of my assessed value. And then the number that goes in the bottom right, 80.80 per $100 of value. What's that word per mean in this case? It's a fancy word for, there we go, slash it again. It's a fancy word for divide. So you take your 0.80 per 100, and we get a number that I can put in my T-bar of 0.008. Up down line on the T-bar means multiply. So we take our assessed value times our tax rate. And I get annual taxes of $1,380. Is that what the problem's asking for? Is that what they want to know? No, we're close, but we're not there yet. Remember, I really think, again, by saving this math for last, it allows you to kind of slow down and just focus on this. And especially with the math, once you get an answer, I think you should go back and look at the problem again and make sure the answer you got is what they're looking for. Because if I were a betting woman, I'd say they would have $1,380 as an answer choice. So I need you to make sure they're banking on that, you guys. So I need you to make sure what you're solving for. So we have annual taxes of $1,380. We can't stop here though, can we? The problem wants to know daily taxes. So we take that annual tax and we slash it or divide it by, in this case, 360. So that gives me daily taxes of $3.83. January 1st, taxes are $3.83. January 15th, pick a day in May, April, right? Every single day this year, taxes are worth $3.83. What are we going to do with that daily tax? Hang on to that. We're talking about that in just a second. This was just your fresher. Question comes in. If it doesn't say 360, will it say 365? It's got to say. They're not going to leave anything up to chance. So it'll tell you if they want you to do 360 or 365. So there's good news. They've got to tell you. Questions on the $3.83. Again, that's your refresher from Unit 3. As mentioned, taxes aren't the only thing that we typically prorate. Other shared expenses shared between the buyer and the seller. If there are HOA dues are fun. They could be monthly, they could be quarterly, they could be annually, they could be semi-annually. The problem's got to tell you. But either way, no matter how HOA dues are paid, they're a shared expense. Even if HOA dues are monthly, the month of February, neither one of us own this house for the entire month of February, own this property for the entire month of February. So we're going to take that as a shared expense. Another thing that might be prorated is rent. So if a buyer buys with an existing tenant and lease in place, then they kind of acquire the tenant. Now we're getting into more on that in Unit 11. But the rent has to be shared, prorated between the seller and the buyer, or the old landlord and the new landlord. So we're going to share that tenant this month. We're also going to share that rent. Other things, the only other thing that you may see, and I doubt it, but I still do want to talk about it, would be interest on an assumed loan. So if the buyer is assuming the seller's loan, they are sharing this month's interest payment to the bank. So that's the other thing that we prorate. I'm not going to talk about that tonight. That might be a good refresher for us. Maybe Thursday night, we'll kind of talk about prorating interest, assumed interest. That'll kind of give us a nice refresher on this. For right now, I just want you guys to focus on taxes, HOA dues, and rent. Some verbiage. We've talked about debits and credits. Some verbiage you may see. If an item is accrued, it means it's unpaid. That's all you have to write down. Accrued equals unpaid. A prepaid item then is something that's already been paid. It's something that the seller has already taken care of. So again, just introducing you to some verbiage that you might see on your exam. Accrued is something that hasn't been paid. Prepaid is something that has. Hello. In North Carolina, typically, the contract even says that when we're prorating, somebody's got to pay the day of closing. Yes, somebody has to take responsibility for the day of closing. And typically speaking, in North Carolina, the seller is going to be typically responsible for today's rent, for today's HOA dues, and for today's property taxes. The seller is typically responsible for the day of closing. That $3.83, if we were going to closing today, that would be on the seller. This is where I need you guys to hear me. I need you to always do what the problem tells you. If the problem tells you that the buyer is responsible for the day of closing, then you take that $3.83 and you charge it to the buyer. Please do not argue with the problem. Please. So while we say the contract says the seller is typically responsible for the day of closing, I still need you guys to always do what the problem tells you to do. This is the other thing, and this is a big problem topic in this unit. Please note here that it says that the seller is only typically responsible for the day of closing when we're dealing with a shared expense. There's going to be other expenses that are just on the buyer. For example, anything to do with their loan. Tell me what the seller has to do with the buyer's loan. Absolutely nothing. So doesn't the buyer get to pay those expenses the day of closing? There's some other expenses that are just to the seller, and they will get to pay those on the day of closing. They're going to be responsible for their own stuff. The only time this comes into play is when we're looking at those prorated things, and we need to know who to charge for today. So typically speaking, again, you're always going to do what the problem tells you. I always remember it this way. When we woke up this morning, when our alarm clocks went off this morning, whose name was the deed in? Whose property is it? It's still the seller's, right? If everything goes according to plan today, at some point today, that deed is going to change hands. But when we woke up this morning, it was still the seller's. So who gets to pay for the day of closing? The seller. I don't care if closing's at 8 a.m. or 8 p.m. The seller will typically be responsible when we are prorating. If we're not prorating, everybody gets to pay their own expense, their own debit. Again, to introduce you to more verbiage. I don't know if you're going to see it. I'd rather err on the side of caution than introduce you to it. If the problem tells you to prorate to the day of closing, that day belongs to the buyer. If the problem tells you to prorate through the day of closing, that day belongs to the seller. when you guys see that, and it's like this long. Have you guys tackled any practice on it yet? Have you seen any practice yet? I mean, those buggers are long. Put your pen down, sit back, and just read it. Just take it all in before you start dissecting this thing and breaking down. The buyer gets to, the seller gets through, and please hear me, always do what the problem's telling you. I promise you, the information you need to answer this question is there. I promise. So let's talk about days. As mentioned, we may be dealing with a 365-day year in the actual days of the month. You guys may want to learn the song or the little knuckle trick. I don't know if they'll give you that specifics or not. But somehow, if we're dealing with an actual calendar year, we're dealing with 365. I think what we see most frequently is a 360-day year, 30-day month. I cannot tell you what you'll see on your state exam. This is why I'm introducing you to both. So in a 360-day year, 30-day month, every single month has 30 days, no more, no less. So in a 360-day year, how many days are in October? 30. We don't get to celebrate Halloween, do we? How many days are in December? No New Year's Eve for us, right? How many days are in February? 30. Every single month has 30 days. 30 times 12 is 360. Again, I do know it's a leap year. Nobody, no instructor in this state, no testing center, nobody is changing these problems just for 1 year. So pretend, remember there's real world and there's pre-licensing world. So in pre-licensing world, leap year doesn't exist unless the problem tells you, which I doubt seriously you'll see. Questions? So let's talk about prorating with numbers. Let's talk about prorating. I'm going to use, when we give our examples, I'm going to use the 30-day month and 360-day year. So this is me telling you what the problem says. So I'm going to use the 30-day month, 360-day year. In the first scenario, we got several different scenarios with prorated items. And the first scenario is when something is accrued or unpaid prior to settlement. When you guys prorate, a suggestion that I have, you guys know by now I'm a visual person. And when I prorate, I like to see what it is that I'm looking at. So this is my annual timeline. Again, I'm going to use the 30-day month, 360-day year. This is our annual timeline for taxes. And let's go to closing. What the heck? Let's go to closing today. That'll be fun. So we're going to closing on February 20th. The seller owns the property the front part of the year. The buyer owns the property the latter part of the year. What divides the year is the day of closing. You don't even have to touch a calculator. Who owes the most in taxes this year? Who has the bigger responsibility in taxes this year?
The buyer,
The buyer. Why would you say that?
because the buyer's going to owe the house more months out of the year.
There you go. The buyer owned it for a longer period of time this year. Does this make sense? Thus, who has the bigger responsibility for taxes this year? It's going to be the buyer. But didn't the seller own it for the first month and 20 days? So they still have some responsibility. In this case, accrue, debit the seller, credit the buyer. What's happening here? Who can remind me, again, back to unit 3? When is the tax bill due?
January the 1st.
The lien's placed on the property January the 1st.
September 1st.
There it is. The bill isn't due until September. The tax bill's out. You got a lien on your property on February 20th. You have no idea yet how much it's worth. Isn't that fun? But they're not actually going to send the bill out until August. The bill is due or comes due on September 1st. Whenever we have a closing before September 1st, the best thing we can do is rely on last year's taxes. Everybody with me? On February 20th, I have no idea. I don't even know what the tax rate is yet. We don't know this information yet because it's not come out. So there's no way closing on February 20th that the taxes have been paid because the bill hasn't even come out yet. Everybody with me? So what's going to happen is the bill will come out in September, and then the buyer will be responsible for paying the whole year. Now, let me make sure we're clear. I didn't say the buyer was going to pay the whole year. I said the buyer was going to be responsible for the whole year. It's going to come typically from the lender, from that escrow account that they've been collecting money. They'll collect money for taxes at closing, and then they'll start collecting with the buyer's first payment. So when the bill comes due at the end of the year, the lender will pay them on behalf of the buyer. But again, the key word there is that the buyer's responsible. And because the buyer's responsible for the whole entire year, this is where I like the time frame or the timeline. The buyer will be responsible for the whole entire year. At this point, I actually ask myself, who owes who? You're buying my house and you're going to be responsible for the entire year. Do I owe you money or do you owe me money? I owe you, don't I? So how that's going to show up on the settlement statement is a debit the seller, credit the buyer. That's what we're saying. The seller owes the buyer. And we're going to hash this out. The whole idea of settlement is to settle or finalize everything between the buyer and the seller. So instead of the buyer trying to collect from the seller later in the year when the bill comes out, they're going to collect from the seller now. And on the settlement statement, it's going to shake out to a debit the seller, credit the buyer. The seller owes the buyer for the period of time that they own the property, which is January 1st to February 20th. There are 30 days in a 360-day year. There are 30 days in January plus 20 days in February. Seller owes the day of closing. So the seller is going to owe the buyer 50 days. Debit the seller. So using that same daily taxes that we've already figured out, $3.83. Each day, $3.83, we know that the buyer owes the seller for 50 days. So tell me in a private chat, how much does the seller owe the buyer? How much are we going to debit the seller, credit the buyer?
Julie, one more question.
Yeah.
You said right here in this, the 30 plus 20 equals 50. That means 50 days are owed to the buyer from the seller?
That's right, because the seller
Okay.
owned the property this year for 30 days in January plus 20 days in February. So they own the property so far this year for 50 days. Yep. We have those 50 days. We determined that taxes this year are $3.83 every day. So the entry we will see on our settlement statement, the seller owes the buyer $191.50 pre-licensing world, 30 days every month. Every single month has 30 days, unless you're told to use the 365-day calendar.
Will the questions always give us the amount per day?
No. Sometimes they give it to you, sometimes you get to figure it out.
And does it matter if the buyer, so if the buyer buys before September, the buyer will always be responsible for the whole year?
Yes. If taxes are accrued, if they are unpaid prior to settlement. We're going to run a scenario in just a second. Scenario number 2 is, what if the bills come out and they're still not paid? So what if we have a closing later in the year? We'll run that scenario next. Questions on debit the seller, credit the buyer. The seller, all we're saying is the seller owes the buyer for their portion of the taxes. The whole point of settlement is to finalize everything between the seller. Could y'all imagine a world where this didn't happen? And fast forward until September this year, and the buyer, now the owner, they have been for several months now, right? And they get the bill and they call the seller and they say, hey, man, our taxes for the year are due. Send me money. What's the seller going to say? And then they're going to hang up. So how can we make this fair to the buyer? How can we make sure that the buyer gets their money? We prorate it. We hash it out. We finalize everything between the two parties on the settlement statement. And that's what settlement is all about. They should be done with each other on that day with everything. Questions? So this is accrued prior to the bill coming out, prior to September 1st. What if we have accrued taxes after the bills come out? Well, we're not going to actually do a proration in this case. We're going to do something called a double debit. Double debit, how many parties are getting charged in a double debit? How many parties do you think? Yeah, 2. So if that tax bill comes out, we're still looking at a timeline, because I think it's helpful. I find it very helpful to see the responsibility, to see the actual image. So we have January 1st using our 30-day month. We go through the 31st, and now let's go to closing on, November 25th. Seller still owns a property the front part of the year. Buyer owns a property the latter part of the year. If you use the timeline, you might be able to eliminate answer choices just by looking at this picture. If there's a charge where the buyer owes more than the seller, don't even pick up a calculator. Don't we know by looking at the timeline that that can't be the case? Because who has the bigger responsibility now for taxes this year? Who's going to owe more money? The seller. So use the timeline. You may be serious. You might be able to eliminate an answer choice without ever picking up your calculator. Isn't that something? So use the timeline to see who has the bigger responsibility. So here we are. We're after September. The bills come out, but the taxes are still not paid. They're accrued, which means they're unpaid prior to settlement. In this case, what's going to happen is they're going to do what's referred to as a double debit. So we're going to debit the seller for the period of time that they own the property, including the day of closing. And we're going to debit the buyer for the period of time they own, starting the day after closing to the end of the year. Each party will be responsible for their share of taxes. I find it easier when I start counting days. I find it easier to count the person that has the less responsibility, because we could spend a lot of time on the seller, couldn't we? Or if we just look at the remaining of the year with the buyer, that may save you some time. Whenever you're counting forward on the timeline, it's easy to get the days mixed up. So for example, the rest of November, it's easy to get the days mixed up. So I have a highly sophisticated method for you guys to help you get the days right, count the days right. Everybody ready? I want you to count it out when you're going forward on the timeline. I want you to count it out on your fingers. Let's talk about the rest of November. The buyer owes for November 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. There are 5 days left in November, plus 30 days in December, which would give the buyer responsibility of 35 days. If you look at the 26th, it's awfully easy to look at that and see 4 days. And you just got the whole dang question wrong, the whole dang problem wrong, because you didn't count right. When you're going forward on the timeline, every time you go forward on the timeline, count it out on your fingers. You've got to see the 26th, the 27th, the 28th, the 29th, and the 30th. 5 days left in November plus 35 days in, plus 30 days in December gives us a total of 35 days for the buyer. We know our taxes are $3.83 a day. I'm just kind of making numbers up. So the buyer's responsibility would be 134.05, debit the buyer. And then you could just take the annual taxes. I don't remember what that is, but you could take the annual taxes minus the 134.05, and there's the seller's responsibility. Again, you can count the days that the seller owes, but now you're looking January, February, March, April. That's going to take you more time. I suggest start with the shorter and then deduct. So why not start the day for debit the buyer the same day as debit the seller? Can we do it that way? No, because the problem has told us that the seller is responsible for the day of closing. So if we go on the 25th, the seller pays the 25th, the buyer starts paying taxes next day. We don't want to double charge. So 2 scenarios if it says unpaid or accrued. Scenario number 1, debit the seller, credit the buyer, is if settlement happens before September 1st. Scenario number 2 of the double debit is if settlement happens after September 1st. Yeah.
Julie, I have a question. Can you say that what you said? Can you say that again, please? What you just said?
So 2 scenarios if taxes are unpaid. The first scenario, debit the seller, credit the buyer, is if closing happens before the bill comes out, before September 1st. The second scenario of double debit is how we're going to handle it if closing happens after September 1st. Still accrued, still unpaid. It's just now a matter of when did settlement happen. That's the difference in the 2. Anything else before we look at our final proration scenario? There's only 3. Can I erase the pink? Everybody good? The final scenario is if taxes have been paid prior to settlement. The seller has paid the taxes before we got to settlement. So somebody tell me, where are we on the calendar year? Where are we in the calendar year for this to happen?
It would be after September, right?
It would be after September. That's right. So now the question is, it's after September. Have taxes been paid or not? The only way they can be paid is if we have the bill. We don't get the bill until September 1st. So prepaid, we've gotten the bill, and now we're going to go to settlement. The taxes have been paid. So now let's go, let's have a Christmas closing. And let's go December 10th. Seller owns the front part of the year, buyer owns the latter part of the year. Again, what did that take me? 20 seconds on my scratch paper just to be able to see that visual, just to be able to see that image. Taxes have been paid, which means the seller has sent in the tax bill for this property. The county is satisfied. Taxes have been paid for this year. So if the taxes have already been paid, again, a very important question to stop and ask yourself. Who owes whom? If the seller's already paid, who owes whom?
The buyer owes the seller.
The buyer owes the seller. Yeah. And
Sorry,
in settlement statement world, we call that debit the buyer, credit the seller. The buyer is paying the seller for, think of it as they're paying them back. The seller's already paid the taxes. Put yourself in the seller's shoes. You're going, whoa, I already paid this whole tax bill. I should get some money from somebody. Isn't that fair? And as a seller, who's the only person you can get money from? Buyer. So they're going to pay their responsibility. So the buyer owes the seller for, seller's responsible for the day of closing, which means the buyer's responsibility starts tomorrow through the end of the year, 30-day month. And then we just got to count. So we got the 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. I'm getting 20 days. Count on your fingers. It's so easy just to, I'm not going to count on my fingers. I'm going to save myself time on my test. It's so easy to just look at that and see 19 days. Please don't do that. Take however long it takes you to count and count them out. I'm going to have you guys doing all sorts of dumb stuff on your test. Wait till we get to the appraisal unit. But whatever it takes to help you remember it, right? So the buyer would owe the seller for their portion of the year, which would be for the last 20 days. And again, if you want to, we know our daily taxes, the example we're using, we know our daily taxes of $3.83. So the buyer would owe the seller, for $76.60. This makes the seller whole. This reimburses them. They pretty much paid 20 days of taxes on the buyer's expense, on the buyer's behalf, didn't they? So we've got to make the seller whole. And guys, please go back to the big picture of prorating. It's all about making it fair for the two parties. Is this fair? Yeah, it's not a lot, but shoot, $76.60 when you're buying or selling a house, all that adds up. Questions on prorating? 3 scenarios. Yeah.
I have a question, but it's not really on prorating. It's just I have trouble differentiating debit and credit. Which one is owing?
So a debit is money that you owe. It's money going out.
Okay.
A credit is money you have coming in. Somebody owes you, it's coming in on your behalf. The example we gave was looking at your bank statement. When you go to Harris Teeter, you swipe your card at the counter. How's that show up on your bank statement? It's money that you owe, right? It shows up as a debit.
Okay.
When you get your direct deposit bonus from work on Friday, how's that show up on your bank statement? It's money coming in. That's a credit. We're getting, okay, so January 5th in tax world is the due date. After January 5th, they start collecting interest. I encourage you to go back to Unit 3 and review taxes. I think the timeline, I can't do it without I'll be really honest with you guys. Where I struggle with prorating is figuring out which party gets the debit and which party gets the credit. But where I struggle most is who owes who. And you know what helps me work that through? The timeline, where I can take that information and actually visualize. This is the seller's responsibility. This is the buyer's responsibility. They have been paid or they have not been paid. And then I can stop once I set myself up. If you guys haven't written it down yet, please do so. Who owes who or whom? I don't know what the grammatically correct thing in that is, nor does it matter. Somebody owes somebody, and that's what we got to figure out. Who owes whom? Whom just sounds cooler, doesn't it? Sound like I know what I'm talking about. We're going to stick with whom.
In
Yeah.
this problem, it would be debit buyer.
So we're going to debit the buyer and credit the seller. Yep. So the buyer owes the seller. And again, we got to speak settlement statement verbiage. And in settlement statement speak, it's a debit the buyer, credit the seller. All right, let's take our first break. We come back, we're going to talk more about these debits and credits. We're going to take what I asked you guys to look at, pages 387, 388, and kind of break that down. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And we're getting closer and closer to actually working our mini CD. So take 10, we come back, we'll keep going. All right. So I am making attendance. Welcome back. Oh, gotcha. Oh, Richard, just in. I got you. Heather, you're in. You guys are good. Just in that split. Let me do it again just to be sure. Sure. Okay. All right. So let's talk about things that are going to typically be debits and credits to the seller. Let's start with the seller first. Sellers are easier. They don't have as many debits. So from page 587 and 588, I think, like we said the other day, this is like your formula for doing these problems. You know, like we say with formulas, 80% of the battle is knowing the formula. Well, in this case, 80% of the battle is knowing what's typically a debit and a credit to the seller, debit and a credit to the buyer. So from page 587 and 588, we can do a nice little breakdown. Things that are typically debits to the seller are going to be commission, the deed preparation fee, and excise tax, in addition to their expenses. So outstanding liens, unpaid mortgages, last year's taxes. If they never paid 2023 taxes, that would be the seller's responsibility. Another debit to the seller, it's one of those double entry items, is due diligence. Remember when we went under contract, the buyer handed the seller a check for the due diligence fee. Let's think about that in settlement statement speak. If I give you a check, here you go. When it leaves my hand, it's a credit for me. When it enters your hand, it's a debit for me. When it enters your hand, then it's a credit. That's money coming in. Money left my hand, debit. It enters your hand, credit. Now that we're here at settlement, we're going to reverse what we did when we went under contract. The sellers already collected that money when we went under contract. They can't collect it again. We need to reverse that. So the due diligence fee at settlement will be a debit to the seller. And of course, the big credit to the seller is the sales price. That's what the buyer is offering to give them, right? In exchange for the property. So if the buyer owes the seller the sales price, it's going to shake out as a credit to the seller. The seller, we're going to see in just a second, has fewer debits than the buyer. So one strategy you may want to take is knowing the things that are going to be debits to the seller, and then knowing that everything else will be a debit to the buyer. Remember, what we're building up to is the problem that's going to ask you, how much does the buyer have to bring to closing? So if that's the problem we're focusing on, why do we care about sellers' debits? Well, y'all remember those distractions they like to give you in problems? I wouldn't put it past them to tell you, for example, the deed preparation fee. And if we don't know that that's a debit to the seller, then we're going to want to do something with that. So they put it in there to try to throw you off. So we do need to know what things the sellers are responsible for so we can avoid those distractions. So let's talk about things that are typically going to be debits to the buyer. The sales price. The buyer owes the seller the sales price. So that shakes out, debit the buyer, credit the seller. The buyer's debits will be anything related to their due diligence, such as inspections, investigations, tests, surveys. Whatever they choose to do for their due diligence will be a debit to the buyer. For our purposes, unless we're told otherwise, the inspections, the tests, the survey, the investigations, those vendors, and in the real world, will allow the buyer to pay for the home inspection at settlement. So because of that, it'll show up as a debit to the buyer. That's money that owes. So yes, the home inspector will say, if you pay now, I'll knock 10% off. Truth is, buyers are buying a house. They may not have that extra money laying around. So in the real world, most home inspectors will allow the buyer, for example, to pay at settlement. And that's how we're going to handle these problems unless we're told otherwise. Lender's fees are going to be a debit to the buyer. Remember, the buyer's originating the loan with the lender. That's the relationship. This lender has absolutely nothing to do with the seller whatsoever. So any kind of application fee, loan origination fee, discount points, something called interim interest, which we're getting ready to talk about, all those lender fees, that's between the buyer and the lender. So those will be debits to the buyer. The buyer hires the attorney. So who gets to pay that bill? The buyer. That'll be a debit to the buyer. The buyer gets to pay to have their brand new deed recorded. They get to pay to have the lender's deed of trust. T. Dallas. You lost me. And then title insurance. The buyer's got to pay for their new title insurance policy that originates and starts on the day of settlement. Title insurance is a one and done. This isn't something that they have to renew annually or something. They pay for it one time and they're covered for as long as they own the property. Remember what we said about title insurance. There's typically two policies. If a lender's involved, there's two policies. One for the buyer, one for the lender. The buyer gets to pay for both. There's also some things that are going to be paid before settlement. And again, we need to be aware of these so we don't charge the buyer again. So things that are POC, paid outside of closing. The appraisal. The appraiser is not going to go out and do their thing until they've been paid. Lender requires it. The appraisal is a property of the lender, but they let the buyer pay for it. That's a POC. Again, when you see that, it's a distractor. Also, the credit report fee. The lender will have to pull the buyer's credit report and they'll charge a fee to do that. And that's got to be paid outside of closing. If you see these, unless you're told otherwise, they're distractors because they've already been paid. The buyer has a few credits. Due diligence fee and earnest money. Credits to the buyer. Remember when we went under contract? We looked at our buyer and we said, you're going to pay due diligence fee and earnest money, and both will be credited back to you at settlement. Now here we are. So we need to credit both earnest money and due diligence. And the other credit the buyer is going to see on the day of settlement is their new loan. The lender is bringing that money in on their behalf. Let's say buyer and seller have an agreement to, I don't know, making numbers up here. So we got $100,000 sales price. And the buyer's willing to bring 10%, which means they're bringing $10,000. We cannot complete this transaction until the lender shows up with their 90%, until the lender shows up with the loan to value 90% or $90,000. That $90,000 today, the day of settlement, will be a credit to the buyer. The buyer will spend the next 30 years paying the lender back. Questions. Again, all this is a breakdown on 587 and 588. I want you guys, when you start doing these problems, we're going to go through one in class together, and then trust me, I got lots of practice for you guys. But as you start doing these problems, I want you to reference 587 and 588. You cannot use it for your exam, but if you reference it now, that'll kind of get you knowing what's this debit, what's this credit. And eventually you'll find that you'll be able to wean yourself off. But I think sometimes there's a fear that the very first problem you do on your own, you have to know it. I don't want you to do that to yourselves. That's a lot of pressure to put on yourself. So you got the cheat sheet, we'll call it, the guide to help you get through these, to get a few of these. And yes, eventually you do have to wean yourself off. You cannot use page 587 and 588 for the test, but don't be afraid to use it while you're learning, while you're getting that practice. Questions on what's a debit to whom, credit to whom?
Julie, T Dallas was the debits to the buyer backwards. I'm all about abbreviations. It helps me
Debits
remember
to the
stuff.
buyer backwards.
Yeah.
So I'm still trying to figure it out, Rachel. So
I
it's
understand what she means. If you go back to this slide, it's the first letter of it. It's an acronym backwards.
so title insurance, deed, I got you, attorney's fees, lender fees, anything related. I got you. So you just T'd out. I see it now. Whatever helps. Whatever helps. Thank you for sharing that, Rochelle, and explaining it to me. I didn't see that. So at least if you have that, you know you got to fill it in, right? So you know that's what those acronyms. Other questions on buyer's debits, buyer's credits, sellers? Again, you guys, the seller's responsible for their own. The only reason we specifically bring out commission, deed prep, and earnest or excise tax is because we need to know that those are debits to the seller. If the seller has an outstanding mortgage, then that'll be a debit to them to pay that off. They will also have to pay the recording fee to release that lien. So when you see recording fee, I need you to see what it is the recording fee is for. Is it to record the new deed? That's on the buyer. Is it to record a deed of release? That's on the seller. And that's what the rest of 588 is talking about with the seller. Delinquent taxes. Remember all those judgments, those specific liens and general liens. Anything they find, those will all be debits to the seller because it's their own expense. The last piece of math we need to discuss before we just jump in and do one of these mini CDs, we're still building up. I'm sure it talks about it in your book somewhere, but I've not really found a place that makes me happy. So we're going to go off book for just a minute, and we're going to talk about something called interim interest. This is going to apply when the buyer is originating a new loan. Remember what we said last week. Interest is paid in arrears. Who can remind me what that means? Arrears. Where's your arrear?
Behind.
Is in the
Behind
back.
you. That's
Oh.
right. Next dumb thing I got you guys doing on your test. I want you counting on your fingers, and I want you to look where arrears is, because arrear is behind you. So in other words, what we're saying is when you made your mortgage payment on February 1st, you paid January's interest. When you make your mortgage payment on March 1st, you're paying February's interest. I have everybody so far. So let's talk about what happens when a new loan is originated. And when I say originated, means it just starts today, the day of settlement. I once again like the visual of a timeline. So let's say we're going to go to closing Let's go to closing today. Let's stick with today. Buyers originating a new loan, which means their loan starts today. Anytime the buyer originates a new loan, they do not have a mortgage payment on the first. Their first mortgage payment in this case will be April 1st. Whenever you originate, every time you originate a new loan, we always skip the first. So if we're going to closing on February 20th, there is no mortgage payment on March 1st. The buyer's first payment will be on April 1st. And we've already said that interest is paid in arrears. So when they make that payment on March 1st, that is when they'll pay, I'm sorry, April 1st, that's when they'll pay March's interest. I cannot charge them. I cannot make them pay a payment on March 1st because interest is in arrears. And if you make them pay a mortgage payment on March 1st, they're paying all of February's interest. Is that fair? There are 19 days this month that they didn't even own the property. They didn't have a loan. So why are we trying? We can't charge them interest until we originate the loan on closing day. Remember, our debt service, our principal and interest it's the same every month. They're not going to prorate that because we have a broken month, because we have a less than full month. So with interim interest, with any interest, I should say, originating a new loan, always skip the first. Your first payment will be due the next first. Interest is paid in arrears. Do I have questions so far? We'll talk about the rest in a second. We'll make sure we're good with the arrears part. Put your lender hat back on. I give you money today. I give you $90,000 today. When do I want to start collecting interest? Next week? Tomorrow? No. When do I want to start collecting interest? I heard it. Today. Because we can't charge for a full month in February because they didn't own it for a full month in February. Often what we see in settlement is an interim interest charge. The lender charges the borrower, debit the buyer, for the day of closing to the last day of that month. Interim interest is always, hear my absolute word, interim interest is always the day of closing to the last day of just that month. Never ever go into the next month. They will collect interest for March 1st when the buyer makes their first payment on April 1st. So now we got to count on our fingers again, right? How many days do we have left in February? We got the 20th, the 21st, the 22nd, the 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29, and 30. There are 11 days. And remember, the buyer, this is between the buyer and their lender. So this will be a charge for them today. So the buyer, to get caught up on their interest, they owe the lender for 11 days. Questions on the number of days before we, okay? Questions on the number of days before we look at the rest. Interim interest is always the day of closing to the last day of that month. If we go to closing on February 30th, we still skip the first. So if we go to closing on February 30th, then now they're just charging 1 day of interim interest. Always skip the first. So now we got to figure out how much. And this is a refresher on one of the steps we saw in Unit 14 when we were amortizing, when we were breaking that down using those 3 steps. So we had our balance times our interest rate, TERESTINTER. On the day of settlement, the balance is the loan amount. So the balance is the loan amount times the interest rate. That gives me annual interest. Now we need to break annual down to daily. So your balance times your interest rate gives you annual interest. We know that formula. We use that when we amortize. When we amortize, we divide it by 12 to break it down to monthly. But this time, we need to take annual interest, divide it by 360 or 365, whatever the problem tells you, to get daily interest. So does the buyer pay the 11? When does the buyer pay the 11 days? At settlement. It'll show up as a debit to the buyer on the settlement statement. So whatever daily interest is times 11 days, that will be our debit the buyer. Interim interest. Lender hat on. You got to get your payment. That's why you're in the game. That's why you're in the lending business, is collect interest. You're going to start collecting it the day you originate the loan, the day you send that money in on somebody else's behalf. So I counted the 20th, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. I get 11. I'm telling you. I know you guys, I hear you. I cannot believe she's suggesting I'm an adult and this woman is suggesting that I count on my fingers. Are you kidding me? Yes, I'm very serious. Count it out. I'm telling y'all, if you put in 10 days, you've missed the whole problem. Not because you don't know what you're doing, but because you didn't count right. They cannot take these away from you on test day. Interim interest. All we're doing is getting caught up. The lender has collected 11 days of interest, whatever that shakes out to. At settlement, this buyer, in a sense, has paid their interest through the end of February. No payment on March 1st. Skip the first. And then their first payment will be on April 1st, in which they will pay March's interest. Questions?
I'm so sorry. Something isn't clicking for me. You said skip the first. Tell me again what that means.
That means they do not have a payment due March 1st. They can't make a payment on March 1st. So if they're skipping the first, in this case, this buyer's first payment will be due on April 1st. I'm using a 360-day year for these examples, 30-day month, 360-day year.
Skipping the first, they're still charging you interest from the very first day, right?
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're doing right here in interim interest. Why 11 days? Because we're charging the buyer for the day of settlement, the day that the loan was originated, from the last day, or sorry, from the day of closing to the last day of that month. And in a 360-day year, every single month has 30 days. 30 times 12 is 360. So there's the 20th, which is the day we went to closing, the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, and 30th. I got 11 days. Remember, the relationship here is between the buyer and the lender. What's this have to do with the seller? Absolutely nothing. Is the seller going to pay the buyer's interest? Well, I mean, I guess anything's negotiable, but let's be honest. No. So the buyer's going to pay their interest the day the loan originates. Interim interest is getting them caught up. Now the lender's happy. The lender's been paid for the rest of February, and they know they'll start collecting their monthly payments every month for the next 30 years, starting on April 1st. Can I do one more like this? We're getting ready to do a whole problem. Okay. So we'll see this again in just a second. We're going to work one of these through. I'm just still leading you guys up, still building you up. All right, let's wrap this up though, this part of the conversation up. Let's bring this home and talk about what all this means to me and you. The whole reason we're here is because we need an understanding of these settlement statements. As agents, we have a duty to help our buyers and sellers make sure that their final numbers are right. Remember OCAR? What's that A in OCAR?
Accounting.
It's accounting, making sure that their numbers are accurate. So we're going to review these settlement statements for our sellers. We're going to review these settlement statements for our buyers, guys. They don't know these things, but we have a duty to help them make sure that their final numbers are right. Watch your words. I am not responsible for all of the entries on the settlement statement. I can only be responsible of which I have knowledge. When I get the settlement statement, the numbers, for example, that I can verify, I can make sure the sales price is right. I can make sure the earnest money is right, due diligence. Is there a home warranty? Seller paid closing costs? How do I know that that's right? What can I use to verify that?
Contract.
Yeah. Don't we have a legally binding contract between the parties saying this is our sales price, this is our due diligence, this is our earnest money? If we made any amendments, then we need to make sure that the amendments are correct. Did we add earnest money, for example? Did we reduce the sales price? So when I get a CD to review, that's the very first thing I do. I don't know about y'all's little brain, but considering we just went under contract 5-6 weeks ago, I don't remember these numbers. And when I get this settlement statement, the first thing I do is pull out the sales contract and make sure those numbers are right. We also talked about invoices. You're going to get invoices from the home inspector, from the surveyor. They're going to send them to you for you to send them to the attorney so they can get paid when this thing closes. Once I have that invoice in my hand, don't I have the ability to verify that that amount is correct? Can I go back to my file and pull out the invoice and make sure it's right? You guys now know how to prorate taxes. By the time I'm done with you, you'll know how to do interim interest. I'm not responsible for the whole thing. I am responsible for what I can verify. And when, I wish I could stand here and tell you guys, if you see a mistake, when you see a mistake. You guys, humans prepare these things. Do humans make mistakes? Any of y'all ever make a mistake? Occasionally, sometimes, right? Yeah. When you find a mistake, that's our fiduciary duty, is to call the attorney, call the lender and say, I don't think these taxes are right. Or, oh no, I forgot to send you the home inspector's invoice. Please add this now. I think I told you guys last week, I reviewed one of these things and my commission wasn't on there. What happens if I didn't catch that? I don't even want to think about that. That just makes my heart flutter a little bit. We have a duty to verify these things. And when you find an error or when you have a question, we have a duty to figure it out. Maybe you take it to your BIC first, especially if you're new. Say, this doesn't look right. Can you help me verify this? This is one place I think agents like to get shy. You're worried you're going to hurt somebody's feelings by calling the lender and saying, this doesn't look right to me. How is that old car for your buyer or seller? Is everybody with me? Remember who our duty, who our loyalty, who gets old car. It's not the lender, it's not the attorney, it's our client. So the things that we can verify, we can make sure the debits and credits are in the right place. We can make sure that the numbers from the sales contract, sales price, due diligence, earnest money. Again, did you do any amendments? Did you change anything? Make sure those are right. Prorated items, interim interest. We'll review excise tax in just a second, maybe. And then I can just straight up add, right? I can just add columns, make sure the bottom of page 1 adds up, bottom of page 2. That's like post licensing stuff. But yeah, when I get a settlement statement to review, I pull out my contract and my calculator. Those are the first 2 places I start. And like we said, any unpaid invoices. So what happens if we don't? What happens if we don't review these things? What happens if we say, oh, I'm sure it's fine. As long as my commission's right, that's all I really care about. Again, what's the real estate commission's main purpose? I see mouths move. It's to make sure you're getting the money that you should, right? Isn't that why they're in business? No. They are there to protect the public. And nothing protects the public but like making sure their money's right. And that's why we're here. What questions do I have? Again, all that was from the syllabus. I went off book, the last few slides there. Of course, you got the PowerPoints and the online learning system as well. All right, let's wrap up 21 on the PowerPoint so we can look just at the settlement statement. So those key terms on 541, there's more in 21 than the settlement statement. It's our whole, basically our contract to closing process. So we spent a lot of time talking about the buyer's due diligence, what happens from the time we go under contract to the time we close. Key point review on 589, your student quiz on 591. There are some sample buyer. I think there's even some seller in there. Again, that's not going to be your test question, but if you can do those, you're familiar with debits and credits to the seller. That may give you some extra practice. Both of your exams will ask you, how much does the buyer have to bring to closing? I put this here just as a refresher. This is how we started the class today. This is how we ended last week. So this is your reference page. You guys have this a couple times now. Where can I get this information to prorate? Where can I get this information to do these various things? That's what that is. And then those 50 problems in the back of the book. These are the numbers that relate to what we just did. Before you start writing, please listen to me. In addition to the how much does the buyer have to bring to closing, you may see a standalone proration problem. So learning how to do these things, you may see a standalone interim interest problem. So learning how to do these things may get you more than one test question. You can learn how to prorate. And that's what a lot, and there is some mini CDs in the back of the book, but that's what you're going to see in your practice as well, is just some standalone proration. Getting you prorating might get you a couple, one or two test questions. What questions do I have before we launch into one of these? All right, so we're going to go off PowerPoint for just a bit. And where I'm going to look, we're going to do one together that we have in the online learning system. So let's look at first at what we got here. So if we scroll down to unit 21, you can see you got a mini CD1 with the answer key, mini CD2 with the answer key, 4 with the answer key, 5 with the answer key, plus you have stuff in your book, you have other things. Remember the math workbook? There's some mini CDs in there as well. Where's mini CD3? You might be asking yourself. It's of my opinion that mini CD3 is harder than anything you will ever see on your test. If you're up for the challenge, just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to respond. But let's master 1, 2, 4, and 5 before we worry about 3. Fair enough? By the way, I've never had anybody reach out to me up for the challenge, so don't feel. It's only people like me that would be up for that. And I get it. I know who I am. So I'd rather you guys work on these. We're going to do one mini CD1 together. Can I do an example of interim interest? We're getting ready to. We're going to do a full one of these. We're going to do mini CD1 together. And of course, we got the answer key, but that's just for when you leave us and the other practice. When you guys first see your mini CD, and I'm getting ready to do the same, I want you to take scratch paper. I want you to draw a line down the middle. And on the left-hand side, I want you to call it credits. And on the right-hand side, I want you to call it debits. So while you guys are doing that to your scratch paper, I'm going to do that to mine. And I'm going to call, and I'm actually going to label mine at the top, the buyer, because that is all I care about. This might be one way to help us eliminate those distractions of the seller stuff, because I don't care about the sellers. I just care about the buyer's credits and the buyer's debits. So then we look at, scroll down here and we look at the problem. We're going to try to make this a little bit bigger. We can still get it all on one screen. This is, we got to use our imagination a little bit, but this is in the form of a bullet point. So we got items, you may see them in bullet point version. You may see them in one run-on paragraph. No matter how you see it, start at the top and work your way through to the end. Do not skip around. When you skip around, it's easy to skip something. So you start at the top, you work your way down. And as we said at the beginning of class, this CD is going to be different than another one, then different than another one, different than another one, because every transaction is different. Every CD is going to be different. So again, the more practice we can get, And we're going to read. Let's pretend that we just read this whole thing. And bottom line, the question wants to know, all I care about is how much cash does my buyer have to bring to closing? How much cash does the buyer have to bring to closing? What do they have to bring to settlement? We say cash. Let me rephrase that. Readily available funds. The attorney's not going to show up with a big bag of cash. Here you go. So we're looking for money order or wire transfer, cashier's check, wire transfer, something like that. They can't bring a personal check. Nobody wants to delay closing 5 to 10 business days waiting on that personal check to clear the bank. So we need readily available funds from the buyer. And buyer's agents, it is your responsibility to tell the buyer how much they need to bring. Is everybody clear on what we're doing? What we care about? We only care about the buyer. If it's not about the buyer, then we don't care. And that's our focus. All right. I know I'm a few minutes early for break. Oh no, I don't want to do that. But I don't want to start something just have to stop in a few minutes. So let's go ahead and take our break. I know we're a few minutes early. When we come back, we'll be ready to do our mini CD. welcome back. All right, so cameras are on. I'm going to take attendance. See what we got here. So again, I'm in the online learning system in the Unit 21 material, and we're looking at mini CD number 1. We're going to start at the top. We're going to talk our way through this thing together, and then you guys have plenty of practice to look at. So we have our scratch piece of paper, line down the middle, credits on one side, debits on the other, and that's exactly how we're going to categorize the things that we see. So in the end, we'll be able to add up all the credits, we'll be able to add up all the debits, figure out how much our buyer has to bring to closing. I do suggest putting buyer on that piece of paper somewhere to help keep your focus, because again, I don't care about the seller in this problem. The only thing I care about is how much does my buyer have to bring to closing. So if we can keep our focus on the buyer, that might help eliminate those distractions. So the buyer enters into a purchase contract with the seller to buy the seller's house for $210,750. I can see mouths move. Is the purchase price going to be a debit or a credit to the buyer? Purchase price, debit or credit? It is a.
Is it a credit?
It is a debit. They owe that money to the seller in exchange for the property. Whenever you hear words like owe, to pay, that's a good sign that it's a debit. The buyer owes the seller the purchase price. And what do they get out of it? They get a new house. They get a property. They get a deed. Also, when I'm doing these, I like to label. So you notice I wrote SP there. I do like to, and remember you got test time to keep in mind as well. So you abbreviate as you can. But if we label it and you ever need to go back, that may save yourself some precious test time. So now you know what that number is. So that's just a recommendation I have. Questions on our sales price. Debit the buyer. They owe the seller. Yeah.
Oh,
I think that was you, Rochelle. Is that still from last time? Okay, good. Just want to make sure. I am alert to noise. I never want to miss anything. All right. The purchase contract provides for a November 24th settlement. So when are we going to closing? We're going to go on November 24th. And again, I like to write that date somewhere at the top of my paper because I know I'm going to have to refer back to it a few times. It might save you some precious test time. So we're going to closing on the 24th. The seller has paid taxes prior to closing and will be prorated at settlement using the 360-day method of $2,610. So let's talk about our tax proration. I saw the word prorate, and the first thing I'm going to want to do is draw it out. So we know we're using the 360-day method, which means every month has 30 days. We know settlement is happening. What divides this timeline is the day of settlement. So we're going to go to closing on the 24th, November 24th. The seller owns a property the front part of the year. The buyer owns the property the latter part of the year. All we did was just took that information and put it in a picture so we can talk it through. The seller has paid the taxes. Taxes have been paid. The seller has already picked up the whole tax bill for the whole year. Why don't you guys tell me in a private chat? I want to hear from everybody, please. In a private chat, who owes whom? And you can abbreviate. B is buyer, S is seller. Who owes whom? Private chats. What I'm seeing, the common theme that I'm seeing is that the buyer owes the seller. I would agree. In contract or settlement statement speak, that shakes out to a debit the buyer, credit the seller. That's what we're saying. The buyer owes the seller. It's money coming from the buyer, debit, to the seller, credit. Debit the buyer, credit the seller. Debit the buyer, credit the seller for the period of time that the buyer owns the property. So we're counting the seller responsible for the day of settlement, which means the buyer's responsibility starts the next day through the end of the year. So now we got to figure out how many days. Y'all want to count with me? Let's start with the 23rd, 24th, 25th. Why do I feel like I'm counting by myself? The 26th, the 27th, the 28th, the 29th, and the 30th. So everybody get 8 days with me? 8 days in November. No, did I not do that right? 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, and 30. 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28.
We have a question.
I thought
It says
Do we
20
count the
November
23rd?
24th.
Ah, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what I was
because the closing's on the
that was my
24th.
question.
Closing's on the 24th. So the buyer starts paying taxes. Oh, I went backwards, didn't I? I was like, what are y'all talking about? Do we not know how to count? I just don't know how to. So the day after the 24th is the 25th. There we go. So now, sorry about that. Everybody good? So now if we count, we got the 25th, the 26th, the 27th, the 28th, 29th, and the 30th. It's more than just counting. It's like, putting down the right number too. Okay, so there's 6 days left in November plus 30 days in December gives us 36 days. So everybody, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. 30 days in November plus 30 days in December gives us 36 days. Questions on how I got the 36 days eventually?
So we don't count the 24th?
The seller is going to be responsible for the 24th.
Day of settlement.
I know this doesn't tell us, but for your exams, it will. That's fairly new, by the way. It used to just be assumed. So you're going to run across a bunch of questions that are old. If they don't specify, the seller's responsible for the day of closing, unless they tell you otherwise. So the seller will pay taxes on the 24th. The buyer will be responsible for them starting tomorrow. Now we got to figure out how much. I know my annual taxes are $26.10. Column tells me that. How do I break annual down to daily? We're going to slash it by 360. So 26.10 divided by 360 gives me $7.25. We know there's 36 days. So the buyer's going to owe the seller, debit the buyer, credit the seller, $261. And it's going to go under the debits, and I will do that in just 1 second. I just want to make sure we're good on how I got the 261. Figured out the number of days. We figured out who owes whom. We figured out the number of days. We figured out daily taxes. And then we were able to multiply daily taxes by the number of days. So we got to debit the buyer $261. Can I erase? Yeah.
The 36 days, you wrote 11/25 to 11/30. Shouldn't that be 11/25 to 12/30?
Yes. I just couldn't do that at all, could I? Let's see. Thank you. So this is 11/25. There we go. Thank you. To 12/30. Everybody good on the 261? Can I erase the pink proration math? I got to give myself some more room here. Speak now. Going once, going twice. All right. And I got to like do it one click at a time here. So what we came up with was a debit to the buyer, $261 for prorated taxes. Again, just labeling my work if I ever have to go back. So I got a debit of the sales price. I got a debit of what the buyer owes the seller with prorated taxes. And then it tells us debits and credits for the following items should be made to common practice. What's common practice? It is 587 and 588. It's those 2 pages in your book that tells you the things that are typically debits to the buyer, typically debits to the seller. So I got an earnest money deposit of $4,500. On the 261, can I get that back? Was the prorated taxes. So we eventually figured out there were 36 days. Daily taxes are $7.25. So daily taxes times the number of days tells us that the buyer owes the seller $261. Common practice. So I got earnest money deposit. What am I going to do with that earnest money deposit as it relates to the buyer?
Credit it.
Credit.
Ashley, I like that. Ashley's giving me sign language over there. Yeah, so it's going to be, thank you, it is going to be a credit. Guys, remember, when we went under contract, we looked at our buyer and we said, the earnest money and the due diligence will be credited back to you at settlement. Remember when we told them that? So now that we're here, we have to do that. So I got earnest money credit to the buyer, $4,500. This is our earnest money deposit. Financing. I got a loan of $175,000. What am I going to do with that?
Is that credit?
Uh-huh. Yep. On the day of settlement. Can the buyer buy without that money?
Nope.
No, they can't. So in order to complete the transaction, the lender has to bring that money on their behalf. It's going to be a wire transfer, but they got to show up. They got to show up with that money in order to complete the transaction, because that's what gives the seller the whole purchase price. Through the eyes of the seller, it is the lender's loan to value ratio and then the buyer's down payment. And that's what makes up that whole sales price. So on the day of settlement, that loan amount is going to be a credit to the buyer. Thank you.
So the loan money is his money that's credited from the lender.
The lender, that's right. The lender's bringing it on their behalf. And when you bring me $175,000 today, I'm going to spend the next 30 years paying you back.
Okay. Gotcha.
But remember, you guys, settlement is a snapshot of what's going on today. Uh, 30-year mortgage, don't need to do anything with that. I got an interest rate of 7.5%. Hang on to that. We'll have to come back to that in a second. Then I have a 1% loan origination fee. Remember, all lender charges are of the loan amount. What does the lender care about? Their money. Their money is the loan amount. So we got a 1% loan origination fee. We've decided the loan amount is $175,000. They're charging a 1% loan origination fee. So there's going to be a debit to the buyer of $1,750. I'll put that up in just a second. This is our loan origination fee. And I'll put that up in just 1 second. And 2 discount points to be paid by the borrower. Again, if you look for things like this, to be paid tells you it is a debit. It's money that they owe. So let the words help you, determine that debit or credit. To be paid. So there's our 2 discount points, also of the loan amount. 2 discount points shakes out to what percentage of the loan? 2 discount points is what percentage of the loan? Yep, 2. So I have my loan amount times our 2 discount points, which shakes out to 2%. SP is sales price. So we have $3,500 in discount points. So we got our 1% loan origination fee. I got 2% discount points. Remember when we talked about discount points, I said, you're going to have to figure out how much the buyer's paying in prepaid interest. But I don't want you all to adjust that interest rate unless the problem specifically says, what's the buyer's new interest rate? So all we have to figure out here is, what do they have to bring to settlement? How much in prepaid interest are they bringing? And it's to be paid by the borrower. So we know there's $1,750 for the loan origination fee. There's $3,500 for discount points. Questions on that? Can I erase the math for the loan origination fee and the discount points? Everybody good on how we got those figures? Going once, going twice. Then we have interim interest through November 30th on the borrower's new mortgage. Private chat. I want everybody to tell me in a private chat. If we're going to closing on November 24th, we're originating a new loan on November 24th. When is this buyer's first mortgage payment going to be due? Private chat, please. When is their first mortgage payment going to be due?
Can you repeat that again, Miss Julie?
We're originating a loan on November 24th. When is this buyer's first mortgage payment going to be due? When do they make their first mortgage payment? When? Happy New Year. We originate the loan on November 24th. We skip the first, which means we do not have a mortgage payment on December 1st. You can't make a mortgage payment on December 1st. You'd be paying a whole month's interest. Do we own the property for the whole month of November? No, so that's not fair. So we don't have a payment on December 1st. Your first, and all mortgage payments are due on the 1st for our purposes. They're always due on the 1st. So we skip the first. So our first mortgage payment will be due January 1st, which means for interim interest, we need to get the borrower caught up. So they will pay interim interest from the day of settlement to the last day of that month. May I bust out an absolute word again? Interim interest is always the day of closing to the last day of that month. Never ever go into the next month. So we got the day of
Julie, I have a
closing.
question.
Yeah.
So like I'm trying to like keep my real estate hat on instead of mortgage because where I'm at, we always go to, so it would be January 31st. So is it always going to be the first?
So there's real world and there's pre-licensing world. And in pre-licensing world, we deal with the first.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like in real world, like I'm concerned like on the exam or the state test, like when I'm like, okay, technically it would be the 31st. And I put that, it's technically wrong.
But the payment is due on the first. It's due and payable on the first.
Okay.
I need you in pre-licensing world.
I'm trying.
Come join me. I know sometimes it's hard coming into this with experience, right? Because I got to kind of rewire, but that's where we are. So now we got to count days. We'll see if I can't do it right this time. Y'all count with me, make sure I do it right. So we got the 24th, the 25th, the 26th, the 27th, the 28th, the 29th, and the 30th. Is everybody in agreement with me when I say 7? Okay, good. I'm starting to second guess everything. So there's 7 days left in November, counting the day of settlement. There's 7 days that the borrower owes the lender. Now we got to figure out how much. So there's a formula that we just have to know. And the formula says the balance or on the day of settlement is the loan amount times the interest rate. Remember when I said hang on to that? We'll come back to it in just a second. The problem has got to tell you what the interest rate is. So we know we have a 7.5% interest rate. The balance times the interest rate gives me annual interest. Now that we have annual interest, we need to slash that down to daily. So I'm getting $36,458,333, and we would be okay to round to $36.46. So how much is daily interest? Every single day this year, interest is $36.46. I took the balance times the interest rate and got annual interest. Took my annual interest, divided it by 360 to get daily. Now that I know daily and the number of days, we can take that. Don't clear your calculator to get the most accurate answer. So we have 36.4583333 times 7, and we get 255. Again, rounding just a little bit for interim interest. Questions?
Julie, I got 255.222. Is that okay still?
Yeah, you can't miss by rounding.
Okay.
Questions on interim interest? Can I erase the interim interest math? Going once, going twice. All right, then we have, moving right along, I got private mortgage insurance, PMI. Some lenders collect it the first year. Some lenders will divide it by 12, the annual, divide it by 12 and just tack it on to the PITI payment. So you'd have PITI, PMI. Again, the problem's got to tell you what to do. There is no standard across the board. So in this case, this lender for the first year is going to charge PMI at settlement in the amount of 0.40% of the loan amount. So I got a loan amount of 175,000 times 0.40%. Make sure you get that point in your calculator, very important. Percent gives us $700 that the buyer owes the lender for PMI. What's the word of mean in a word problem? Multiply. So when it says something of the loan amount, that's all we did. 0.40% of the loan amount for the first year of private mortgage insurance. Questions on that? And can I erase that now? Then we have homeowners insurance. Let's talk about homeowners insurance. Any kind of insurance, homeowners insurance, car insurance, medical insurance, when you pay, you're paying for coverage in advance. So if you pay renter's insurance or homeowners insurance, you pay today, you're covered for the next year. You guys make your car insurance payment. You make it on the first of the month, or your medical insurance payment. You make that payment on the first of the month, you're covered for that month. The homeowners insurance company is going to collect, debit the buyer, they're going to collect from the buyer at settlement the first year's homeowners insurance so they can be covered the first year that they own the property. When homeowners insurance comes due next year, they will pay that on their behalf because they've been collecting that through that PITI payment. But to get them through that first year, to pay for that first year, they got to collect the first year's premium at settlement. So this is the borrower's homeowner's insurance. $444 covers them for the first year. And we have a due diligence fee of $250. What am I going to do with that?
Credit.
Credit.
We're going to credit the buyer. They already paid that once. So we're going to make sure that they get that back. So credit the buyer. Due diligence fee, $250. I got an attorney's fee. Buyer hires the attorney. So who gets to pay the attorney's fee? Buyer. It's going to be a debit to the buyer. They owe that for their attorney. Title insurance, yeah.
It's $450 for the attorney's fee.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going all kinds of rogue tonight, aren't I?
It's good. You're keeping us on our toes.
That's exactly why I'm doing it. Thank you. I'm getting there. So we already jumping ahead. I hear you. We got to finish it first. Remember, don't skip around. So we got to finish it first. And all we're doing right now is identifying what are the buyer's credits, what are the buyer's debits. Title insurance. This is to cover the new owner policy for the new owner and for the lender. One time. It's not like they have to renew this every year. They pay for it one time at settlement, and they are covered for as long as they own. So the buyer will pay for their title, their new title insurance policy. Sometimes the problem will give you one lump sum, as did this one. Sometimes it'll tell you this is the owner's policy, then this is the lender's policy, in which case you just need to add them up. But in this case, we got one. Then I got a deed preparation fee of $65. What am I going to do with that?
It's not for the seller.
Ah, tricky, tricky. This is why we need to know the seller's responsibility as well. If the seller is responsible for the deed preparation fee, there's your distractor. Remember, who am I focusing on in this problem? The buyer. So the deed preparation fee, remember, the seller pays to have the deed prepared. And the way I always remember that is when the attorney is getting this deed ready for closing, it's still the seller's deed. So they get to pay to have it prepared. There's your distraction. I would almost guarantee that one of those answer choices is $65 off. Do you have questions on that? And then we have the deed recording fee. What am I going to do with that?
That's a debit.
That's a debit to the buyer. They're going to pay. Whose best interest is to get this brand new deed recorded? It's the buyer's best interest. So the seller pays to have it prepared. The buyer pays to have it recorded. Sometimes you may see a deed of trust recording fee. The deed of trust is the mortgage. If you see that, that's also a debit to the buyer. The deed of trust is on behalf of the lender, but they let the buyer pay for it. Questions on that? Deed preparation versus deed recording. I'm not doing anything with that $65 because all we care about is our buyer. If we were doing the seller CD, then we would care about that deed preparation fee. There's our survey. It's the buyer's due diligence expenses, so we know they're going to pay for the survey. We can almost bank on some, this is an old problem. They're not really courier fees today. Today, you might see more of like a wire transfer fee, right? We can almost bank on some kind of, I kind of call it nickel and diamond to death, you know, some kind of extra fee for either the courier to run or process the wire transfer, something like that. Again, our key words. What does the word fee tell you? It's money that they owe, right? So we're going to have a $25 fee. Courier fee has to be paid exactly. I think those key words can help us. The last piece is the loan escrows. Before I get there, though, let me just pause for a second. Make sure we're all caught up so we can talk about these loan escrows and make sure I don't have any questions. Let's talk about these loan escrows. The lender, remember what we've been saying. When you make that payment every month, it's four pieces. It's your principal and interest, taxes, and insurance. Taxes and insurance are a 12th of the year. So whatever the annual tax and insurance bill is, take that, slash it by 12, and that's going to be tacked on to your monthly payment you send the lender every month, your PITI. That's still going to happen, but remember, we're not making a payment until January 1st. At settlement, the lender will ask the borrower to put some money in to originate the escrow account. And the lender also wants a little bit of reserve. They want some cushion. They can only charge a RESPA requirement, a RESPA rule says that the lender can only charge a 12th of this year's taxes and a 12th of this year's homeowner's insurance. They can't charge more than that. Is there a really good chance taxes are going to go up next year? Yeah. Is there a really good chance homeowners insurance is going to go up next year? Yeah. Next year, when those bills go up, they can recalculate that 12th. My homeowners on the call know that sometimes you get a letter from your banks or your lender saying your payment's gone up. It's not because of the principal and interest. It's because taxes and insurance. So what the lender wants to do, they got to originate the escrow account for this borrower. This borrower does not have an escrow account right now, but they got to originate for them so they have somewhere to put the money, and they want a couple extra months wiggle room. They want a couple extra months cushion. So when these bills go up, they have that money to pay on their behalf. Now, I think this is the concern that comes from the escrow. I'm collecting 4 months of property taxes at settlement. I'm collecting 2 months of homeowners insurance at settlement. And the concern is that the borrower is just giving that money away. And I want to alleviate your concern. When this buyer goes to sell this house or pay the loan off, if there's anything in the escrow, then that will be credited to them, or that will be distributed back to them. They're not taking their money, they're holding their money to use while they're in the picture. Does that make sense? But they got to have something to set up the escrow. And the problem has to tell you how many months of each they want to put in that escrow. Sometimes they will, if you go to pay the loan off and you contact the lender and ask for a loan payoff amount, generally it will not include the money that they have in escrow. Most lenders will distribute that after. We paid my little condo off a couple years ago. I didn't even think, I forgot all about the escrows. Just forgot all about it, because why do you think about it? You know, the whole time I owned that thing, I never paid taxes. I never paid insurance. It just happened. We went and paid it off. Didn't think nothing of it. About 2 weeks later, I got a check in the mail from my lender. And I was like, oh, happy day. What is this for? You know what it was? It was the money that I had left in escrow. They gave me that money back. So I don't want you guys to be concerned that they're taking money. They're just holding it on behalf of the borrower. So now knowing what the purpose is, the problem has to tell us how many months of taxes and homeowners insurance. Sometimes you see loan escrow amount for PMI. Again, just do what the problem tells you. In order to calculate 4 months of taxes and 2 months of homeowners insurance, we do have to go back a little bit into the problem because we're going to base this on this year's taxes and this year's insurance. So we go back through the problem and we remind ourselves that this year's taxes was $2,610. This year's homeowners insurance was $444. So 2610, 444. Let me get somewhere right here. So if my annual taxes are 2610, I need to break that down to monthly. So we're going to take the annual, we're going to slash it or divide it by 12 to get monthly. And then the problem is telling me that the lender wants to collect 4 months. So now that I know monthly taxes are $217.50, we can figure 4 months and get $870. And then we go through that same little exercise with insurance. Again, we start with the annual, divide it by 12 for monthly. And for insurance, they want to collect 2 months. So we have $74 for escrow insurance. Those are both money lender charges. Let's see if I can't get them here. So there's $870 for escrow taxes and $74 for escrow insurance. Originating, starting the escrow account, and then having that cushion. So this way, next year on November 24th, when homeowners insurance is due, if that amount goes up, they have a little bit of wiggle room. They have a little bit of cushion. They can still pay that bill on the borrower's behalf. They can readjust the insurance and collect a 12th of this year's insurance. Same thing with taxes. We got $870 as our cushion. So when that goes up next year, they can still be paid on our behalf. Questions?
And Julie, you said you get the escrow money back when you sell the house or pay it off?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
They're not taking your money. They're just holding it for you so they can pay those bills on your behalf. And if there's anything left, they'll either credit it, or I think what they do more often is just mail you a check a couple weeks later. That was a nice surprise. So understand, I think this causes some confusion when you guys get out there and start working on your own. There are 2 things that we're doing with taxes. There are 2 things that we're doing with insurance. I got 2 things going on. We have to prorate the taxes, share that between the buyer and the seller. We have to prepay the first year's insurance, homeowners insurance. And then we're going to collect some for the escrow, both taxes and insurance escrow. Buyers have a whole lot of debits when they buy a house, yes? Makes sense, doesn't it? There's a lot more going on than the down payment. There's a lot more going on. How do you think the sellers look? They may be heavier on credits because ideally the seller is getting money from settlement. Let me ask you guys, does that happen every time? Is the seller always getting money? No. Sometimes they have to bring money to settlement. Sometimes they're underwater and they owe. But typically speaking, sellers tend to have more credits than buyers. Debits have more, or buyers have more debits than sellers. It's kind of the nature of the buyer owes the seller. What questions do I have? Can I erase escrow math? So now what I want you guys to do, and I have a feeling some of you already are. Now what I want you guys to do is add up all of your credits, add up all of your debits. And what we're going to learn is that debits, let me write that over here, debit minus credit tells us how much our buyer has to bring to closing. So go ahead and add up all your debits, add up all your credits, take all your debits minus your credits, and in a private chat, tell me A, B, C, or D. Can you guys see that? So all your credits and then all your debits. Debits minus credits. So everything in the left-hand column, everything in the right-hand column. Debits minus credits tells us what our buyer has to bring to closing. When in doubt. Yep, you guys have already figured out which one would be the right answer if you included the deed preparation fee. So, as suggested, they're trying to distract you guys. I don't know another way to say that. They're trying to distract you. So how do you beat the distractors? You know the things that are debits to the seller. You know the things that are credits to the seller. So we don't put them on our buyer's CD. About another minute or so, and then we'll see what we got. Thank you. My inner math nerd is shining through tonight, isn't it? Okay. So let's add up all these credits first. What do we have for credits? We have 4,500 earnest money deposit. I got a loan amount of 175,000. Then we have a due diligence fee of $250. So when I add up all their credits, we get 179,750. Then we add up all of their debits, which means I can do that. So we got the sales price. That's what the buyer owes the seller. We got the prorated taxes, loan origination fee and discount points. There's our interim interest, private mortgage insurance, homeowners insurance, attorney's fee, title insurance, deed recording fee, survey, courier fee, and then our escrows for taxes and insurance. And we add up all those debits, we get $219,869.29. Take all those debits minus your credits. And how much does your buyer have to bring to closing? B. To the penny. To the penny. We can't round. We can't tell them, oh, bring about 40,000 and you'll be fine. We got to tell them to the penny. I know it's a lot, you guys. Now, obviously, it took us because we went through it for the first time. If you can do a couple of these for practice, you'll go through them easier, work on prorating. Like I said earlier, you might see standalone problems. So you're going to see this in this type of problem, but you also might have a standalone problem on prorating. It is a whole lot of work for 1 point. I'm aware of that. But I cannot stress the importance of this. This is what it's about. We're protecting our buyers and sellers. What questions do I have? Which one? Which slide? This one? I can't do anything over here. You don't see those numbers on the bottom? It's the 870 escrow taxes and the 74 escrow insurance. They might be kind of cut off. You don't see the top. Yeah, that's not going anywhere. Or
It
this.
amazes me how many people got their hand in the pot when you're already making a big purchase.
It takes a village to buy a house. And you know what? The villagers want to be paid, don't they? Remember our gears, you guys. There's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of people involved. What do you guys think? Was it awful? Not awful, kind of, sort of awful, a little awful.
Nah, I feel like we got through it, but if you give us another one, we'll probably cry.
Don't cry. Don't cry. It is a lot. It's a lot of math. And again, I can't stress the importance of 587 and 588 because that's it's a big part of it. Yes, and it's time consuming. So remember, back to test taking strategies. Always do the math for last. Always save the math for last. Of all the math, this is the very last one you're going to do. I do not want you guys spending all your test time on this problem and then not be able to answer other questions. So of all the math, this one is the very, very last, the very, very end.
Will we see like one like this on your exam?
Oh yeah. And your state exam. And in post licensing.
I have a quick question.
Please.
I was doing the practice math problems and I was adding the loan origination fee and the discount points together.
That's fine.
Just to kind of save that step, but I don't know by me doing that, will I miss something, you think?
No,
Or
because
okay.
what you did, yes, what I did was two separate, right? I did the loan origination fee and discount points. But if you see it, I had 1%. I have 1%. Where's it at? 1% loan origination fee. There it is. I have 1% loan origination fee, and then we had two discount points, and they're both of the loan amount. So 1% loan origination fee and two discount points would be 3% of the loan amount. So if you can see that, perfect. If not, do 1% loan origination fee, 2% discount points. But they're both of the loan amount.
Okay.
So, yep. And if you guys, like I said, if we can do a few of these in practice, you may find, I hesitate to say shortcuts because I don't want you guys, looking for shortcuts. But you may be able to find, little things like that, Rachel, that you can eliminate that step.
Okay.
All right, you guys. We good? Remember, we recorded, so you can go back at your own pace. Plenty of practice, online learning system, that math workbook. Can I erase everything? Can we be done with this? It's getting ready. I'll go. Poof. All that hard work for nothing. It's gone. All right. Let's take our last break. We come back. I want to talk about a few quick things, and then we're going to get started in Unit 17. So let's take 10.
WSFTS student experiences. This is Brent Campbell, Chief Communications Officer for Winston-Salem, Forsyth County Schools. Please move turn.
I agree. And Sandra, that's exactly why I set a timer, because it's easy. Get out there and start unloading the dishwasher, and next thing you know, I'm usually doing some kind of laundry in between. It's a good time to do towel sheets, things you don't have to hang or fold, you know? So, yep, I get it. It goes by fast. I don't want any of y'all question you. That wasn't 10 minutes. Ta-da. All right, welcome back. So, I want to just talk about a few things, a couple reminders. Let me take attendance first. And then we're going to get started in 17. So we'll pick up wherever we left off. We're going to Kahoot on Thursday. We'll do our financing Kahoot. But I just want a couple reminders as we're getting closer and closer and closer. And I know you guys are studying. Remember, when we're reading these test questions, to look out for those absolute words. Because those absolute words mean something. And they may help you differentiate. Are you guys doing these test questions and maybe you get them to narrow down to 2 and now you're stuck on 2 and you don't know which is which? Remember these absolute words. If you're reading an answer choice and it says all, and you can think of one exception, then that's not the right answer. If you're reading the answer choice and it says must, but you know it's not must, it's just highly recommended, it's not must, it's not required, then you know. So I think by paying attention or looking out, I should say, for these absolute words, that's exactly what they mean. There is no exception. There is no other. There is no but. These words are absolute. So pay attention to those. The other thing I want to briefly discuss, I know you guys have, good, this is how we learn, right? I know you guys have been utilizing your book. Is your book well loved yet? Does it look like it's been through it and back? You've probably also been utilizing the online learning system. I discourage you guys from going to Google and finding additional resources because y'all know how Google works, right? You go to Google and you put in real estate school and you could get all sorts of junk. And I don't want you guys out there studying unvalidated information. I don't want you looking at pre-licensing material from another state. So I think this is a good time. If you're seeking other study resources, let me make a couple suggestions. And again, if you're looking for study resources, I suggest reaching out to Lane and I so we can make recommendations on things that we've had experience with. But a couple suggestions. First off, the author of your book, your big old book here, is Dearborn. You guys see that on the front cover? Dearborn has an app. So if you go to your app store or your iPhone or whatever your store is, and you search Dearborn, you can find an app that'll give you kind of like these interactive test questions that the online learning system has. So you answer the question, it tells you right or wrong, and then why. So you may find some, and I don't know the costs or anything on these. You guys would need to check that out if that's something you're interested in. Another resource I may recommend, and you guys got this, I know it's backwards to you guys, but this is Exam Smart. You got this little flyer when you got the booklet of stuff from Lane when she sent you, or you picked up your book and your all that. So Exam Smart is another one you may want to check out. I know there's a fee for this, So you may want to check it out. If you don't have this little flyer, just reach out to me after class and I'm happy to take a picture of it and send it to you. But if I'd stop moving, and again, I know it's backwards for you guys, but you can see it's Exam Smart. It's a real estate exam prep company. They're going to have test questions that you've not seen before. So this may be an opportunity for you guys to kind of, see test questions from different authors. I mean, guys, if we're being honest, there's only so many ways I can ask about dual agency, right? There's only so many ways that we can ask these questions. So I think go through the resources that you have that you've already paid for before you start forking out more money for new one. But if you've been through the book, you've been through the online learning system, and you're thinking, gee, I wish I had more, maybe check out the Dearborn app, maybe check out Exam Smart and see if you can't get some additional test questions there. And again, if these aren't working for you, just reach out to Lane or I. We can make other suggestions. I know Carolina School of Real Estate has a bookstore, so you can order flashcards, you can order supplement books, that kind of thing. But please, please, please don't go to Google. I'll share this story with you. Several years ago, we were still in person, and I had a young lady show up one day, and she was so upset. I mean, the poor thing was about in tears. I said, honey, what's wrong? She said, I'm so confused and I don't know what's going on. I said, oh my word. She had gone to Google and typed in real estate school and started watching YouTube videos of the first thing that came up. Y'all know the instructor that was offering those YouTube videos was in Florida. So no wonder the poor thing was so, I said, show me what you're seeing. It was Florida real estate. Florida's not North Carolina. So I need you guys here. So if you are going to go to Google, at least do North Carolina pre-licensing. At least you can get in the state. Again, I can't validate the internet. So I can't tell you what's good and what's not. All I can tell you are these resources that we've tried and true over the years. Questions or comments? Is the Dearborn app for North Carolina only? That I do not know. It might just be national. I'm not sure. I've not looked at these. But the Dearborn, if y'all are doing it now, that's great, but hold up until after class, please, because we're getting ready to go into more testable material. But just check it out. Again, if you're looking for more, hear me. If you haven't been through the book and you haven't been through the online learning system, start there. You've already paid for those. So before you open your wallet, use what you already have. Again, we've had people order every single book that Carolina School of Real Estate bookstore offers. Guys, you can spend all the money in the world, but if you don't crack that book, it's not going to do you any good. So let me save your wallet. Yeah, and a couple of you, thank you. A couple of you are starting to, because I got a question over the weekend. So remember too, there's review games in here. I didn't know this was in now, but it's like an escape room. So in order to get to the next game, you have to complete this game. So I'm hearing from you guys that the games and the online learning system, there's a whole category called review games. So if that helps you break away from the book, we're getting awfully close to the point where reading is done. We need to start solidifying this information. And guys, I will stand behind this all day long. To pass this exam, you need two things. You not only need to know the material, but you also need to know how to interpret those daggum test questions. So we're almost to the point where we're done reading and we're just doing test questions because we're learning the material, but we're also looking for those absolute words, looking for those distractors. I think somebody asked, and I apologize, I said I'd show it when class started, and then I forgot. Y'all keep me in check. But somebody's asking about the cram course, and I know you guys helped out. I appreciate that. But while we're here, since it's up, that's Friday, March 8th. Lane will send you Jane's Zoom link on March 7th. We're not going to send it out any sooner. because then it'll get lost in your inbox. So Lane will send out Jane's Zoom link on the 7th, so you'll have it. Any comments? All right. Big deep breath. And onward we go. 17 is our appraisers unit. For the most part in this unit, I need you guys to have your appraiser's hat on. Kind of like the lender units. You didn't know you were going to wear multiple hats when you signed up for this class. But again, we're getting a basic understanding of the whole process. And a big part of the sales process is the appraisal. We also have a couple things in here that do relate to the broker. So we'll know when we be able to take our hat off. But for most of it, getting into this unit, let's put our appraiser's hat on so we can learn to think, so we can understand the appraiser's process, so we can help our buyers understand. So our roadmap, we're going to talk about value. We're going to define it. We're going to talk about it. There's 3 approaches to value that the appraiser may take. We're going to talk about those 3 approaches and how they can arrive at their opinion of value. And don't worry, we're not doing any more math tonight. If we get that far, we're just going to skip it and pick it up on Thursday. But there is some math, because in the appraisers, a little bit of math. It's not crazy math. But for the appraisers, they're trying to determine that opinion of value. They're trying to come to a number, which requires some calculations. So each approach to value does have some calculations. So let's talk first. Let's to the basics. Appraiser hat on. And let's define what an appraisal is. This is word for word in your book on page 456, beginning of unit 17. So an appraisal is an opinion or an estimate of value completed by a licensed appraiser of a specific property as of a specific date. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but let's break this down. An appraisal is an estimate or opinion. An appraisal is just one person's opinion on what they think the property's worth. So what I'm telling you is, could another appraiser have a different opinion? Could they have a different estimate of value? Thank you. Sure, because it is one person's opinion. It is one person's estimate. Appraisals are completed by licensed appraisers. They have to go to appraisal school. They have to take a test. They have to apprenticeship. They have to follow a licensed appraiser. It's a process. It is a process to get your appraiser's license. Again, I recommend one thing at a time. So by the end of this unit, some of you might start thinking about the appraisal world. You're already in the throes of pre-licensing. Get your real estate license first, and then you can worry about considering getting into appraising. It's of a specific property. When we are doing an appraisal to originate a loan, this is the purpose of this appraisal, is for the lender to know their loan to value ratio. And all we care about is this one property, our subject property that we'll learn in a second. And it's as of a specific date. The data changes. The market changes. Yes, our markets fluctuate. So it stands to reason that the data changes as well. The appraisal is only as of this specific date. Now, lenders will allow the appraisal. They'll let it count for 6 months. But after 6 months, they're not going to let it count anymore, because the market today is not the same as what it was 6 months ago. So just as we have that roll in market, fluctuations in market, that affects the appraiser's opinion of value. So if the appraiser does appraisals, put your broker hat back on for a second. What we do as real estate agents are CMAs and BPOs. We're going to talk more about these. We're going to compare our CMAs and BPOs to one of the appraiser's approach of value, and we'll talk about the difference of the two. You and I, as the real estate agent, we don't get to say the word value. If you say the word value, you've just acted as a licensed appraiser. I want you guys to go ahead and take that word value out of your vocabulary right now. It's only the appraisers that get to use the word value. What we say as brokers is probable sales price, or if you're in property management, probable lease price. So you're at that listing appointment and the seller looks at you and says, what's your home worth? Or what's my home worth? What can you sell my home for? Do not say this is worth this or the value is that. You say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, the probable sales price is. Also, as brokers, we get to report in a range. The appraiser gives a specific number, dollar amount. Brokers, because we're not licensed appraisers, we get to report in a range. And note here, again, back to with the sellers, what can you sell my house for? I'm not determining, this is helping us determine list price. So I give you what I think the home's going to sell for. I give you what I think the probable sales price. This is what I think a buyer will pay for this property in this range based on the condition of your home. How does it compare to other homes nearby? Have you had the upgrades? Or is your bathroom and kitchen not been touched in 30 years? Is your kitchen still avocado green? You're going to have a different value. You see what I'm saying with the updates, the condition, all that takes into effect. Same thing with buyers. You're working with buyers. They walk in the front door. They fall in love. They say, this is the house of my dreams. And the very next question out of their mouth is going to be, how much should I offer? Well, we're not just going to blurt a number out. We're not just going to say, oh, just offer listing price. I'm sure it'll be fine. I'm sure it's close. No, we're going to do CMA for our buyers as well and give them probable sales price so they can determine what they're comfortable with. Remember, I'm a fact finder. I provide the facts for them to make an informed decision. So I'm providing these CMAs, BPOs. Little history lesson for us. Once upon a time ago, CMAs and BPOs used to mean two different things. Today, we just pretty much use them interchangeably. But once upon a time ago, CMAs were set aside for our buyers and seller clients. So CMAs were done when we were helping the seller determine the listing price, when we're helping the buyer determine their offer price. BPOs were typically done for a third party for a fee. They weren't a buyer-seller client. They weren't a potential seller client. They just want an opinion on the property. And hey, I'll pay you a couple $100 to give me your opinion, to give me your BPO. Couple examples of who that third party might be that might order a BPO. I used to work for a real estate firm that had a relocation company up in Connecticut. They have no idea they've probably never even been to Winston-Salem, not alone know about probable sales prices and values in Winston-Salem. And if they had a relocation client move into this area, they were trying to get a head start on what home prices are around here. So they may, for example, hire me to do a BPO just to give my opinion on that probable sales price, so they can advise that relocation buyer. Another example, I had a lady in post licensing. This comes back up in post licensing, by the way. But I had a lady in post licensing, and she said that she was working with a seasoned agent. She was shadowing a seasoned agent, and the seasoned agent got a call from a divorce attorney that was trying to settle a divorce. And he wanted a guesstimate of what the house was worth. She wasn't getting the listing. It wasn't possible. The attorney was just trying to get an idea so he could finalize that divorce settlement. So again, once upon a time ago, they used to be something different. Today, we just kind of use them interchangeably. That idea of doing a BPO or CMA for a fee is important because soon to be you guys, my provisional brokers, you cannot charge a fee for doing a BPO or CMA. Hear me, you can do it, but you can't charge a fee. So that relocation company in Connecticut, they cannot pay you for their opinion. Did you hear me when I said my post-licensing student? It was the seasoned agent she was following that got the call to do the BPO for that divorce attorney. So PBs, non-provisional brokers, PBs cannot charge for a fee. None of us can charge a fee when it's part of our general brokerage services. When we're having the conversation with the seller, maybe I don't even know if I'm getting a listing or not. Maybe this is a competitive listing. But in a competitive listing appointment, don't you think the topic of how much can you sell my house for is going to come up? So even though I don't know I'm getting the listing, I still need to be prepared so I can get the listing. I cannot charge the seller for that because that's part of my general broker services. Remember that buyer that said, let's write it up. How much should I offer? I can't charge them a fee for that. They're already paying my commission to do that. Could y'all imagine a world where the buyer says, this is my dream house. How much should I offer? And I say, well, cash at me $300 and I let you know. We can't do that, you guys. It doesn't work like that. So none of us, I don't care who you are, BIC, PB, full broker, none of us can charge a fee when it's just part of our job. We're going to talk more about CMAs and BPOs. Again, they mimic one of the appraiser's approach to value. So we'll be able to talk about the difference between the appraiser sales comparison approach and our CMA and BPO. Questions so far? All right, appraiser hat back on. Let's talk more about this value. Value is the relationship between the desired item and the consumer. Put real estate aside for a second. Just pretend real estate doesn't exist for a second. Every single one of us on this call are consumers, right? We're out every day. Maybe we'll be in the grocery store or the clothing store or Amazon or the gas station, but we're out every day as consumers spending money. And as a consumer, if we don't see the value in it, are we paying for it? Are we spending that money? And probably not. Have you guys ever been shopping and you picked a sweater off the shelf and you thought, man, that's a nice sweater and I love the colors and it's so soft and what a beautiful sweater. And then you look at the price tag and you see that it is more expensive than more than you would ever pay for a sweater in your life. What do you do with that sweater? You gently put it back. I don't want you to snag it because then you have to buy it, right? You gently put it back. If you don't see the value in that sweater, the consumer's not going to pay for it. Now let's go bigger scale and talk about a house. If the buyer doesn't see the value in that house, they're not going to pay for it. Can we all agree? Have you guys ever heard the statement, value is in the eye of the beholder? It depends on whose eyes you're looking for. The seller naturally comes into this with more value on the property. To the seller, this is their home. I mean, Blood, sweat, and tears went into this home. You remember when little Susie fell right there and scraped her knee? Oh, to the seller, this is the home. They have more value. To everybody else in the world, it's just a house. So by showing the seller these numbers, showing them CMAs and talking it through and having these conversations, it definitely helps us determine and the appraiser determine what a typical potential consumer buyer would pay for it. And in order to have value, we have to have dust. The D in dust is demand. There has to be the need for it. There has to be a desire. If nobody wants it, it doesn't have much value, does it? So we have to have demand. We have to have utility. How is it going to satisfy the future owner's needs? You guys ever see advertising homes for sale? If not, you will. And the whole description, not the whole description, but a big chunk of the description is talking about custom built this and custom designed that. Custom, custom, custom. Who is that customized for? The one that did it, right? Not necessarily the future, the next owner. When I hear custom this and custom design that, I hear cha-ching, 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 because there was something that went into that that wasn't the norm. So we need utility. How does it fit? How does it meet the future owner's needs? We're going to talk more about that. Scarcity, how scarce is the property? For example, there's only so many homes we can get around a body of water. Water properties tend to have more value because of the scarcity. There's only so many homes we can get up and down the ocean. There's only so many homes we can get around Belews Lake. And then transferability. Is it easy to transfer? Do we have clear title? Can we get clear title? Are there issues with it? So this is part of what the appraiser is determining with value.
What was utility again?
How it meets the future owner's needs. And I'll say that I'm all about a homeowner doing whatever they want to with their home while they own it. I'm all about it. It's yours. Go nuts. Do what you want to do. Just don't expect it to meet the next person's needs. Does that make sense? Because you spent all this time custom building something, and that buyer is going to walk in the door and go, oh God, I would tear that down on day one. It doesn't meet their needs. So when we talk about value, we have to talk about market value. Market value is what the appraisers determine. Market value says this is the most probable price that this property will sell for in a typical market. It's a fair sale. What do you mean by fair sale? I hope if my parents sell me their house, they'd give me a discount because, you know, I'm their daughter. I hope they wouldn't charge me the same thing that they charge you. That wouldn't be a fair market because they're offering me a, you know, friend and family discount. So under typical conditions, a fair sale, what the appraiser is looking for is market value, the most probable price that a property will bring. Let's do some comparison. If the appraiser is determining market value, the buyer is determining market price. The appraiser can offer their opinion all day long, but at the end of the day, what really counts is what is a buyer willing to pay for this property? What is the market price? Let's also compare, same thing, market value to market cost. Some sellers want 100% return for what they put into it. I put a new roof on it 4 years ago. I redid the sump pump in the basement last month. We're not going to get 100% return. You guys, I've always heard the very first time you drive a brand new car off the lot, as soon as it hits road, it starts losing a little bit of value, doesn't it? Same thing. Is a new roof more valuable than a 30-year roof, a 30-year-old roof? Well, of course it is. But that new roof isn't going to get 100% return. And sometimes, I want to know what sellers did. I want to do I want to know the improvements because it does add value. It adds to what I think their probable sales price is. But everybody needs to understand that we're not going to get 100% return. There's such a thing as over upfitting, overdoing. For example, not all neighborhoods will support an in-ground pool and granite countertops. Now, if you want to do that to your home, that's fantastic. But if the neighborhood doesn't support it, you may not get that return. Have you guys ever heard the saying, putting lipstick on a pig? That may be kind of what we're talking about here. So some forces that influence value, our social forces. These are our trends in marriage and divorce, family size, longevity. We're living longer than we ever have. We're seeing different dynamics under the roof, especially since the pandemic. We have 2 families under one roof in some cases. Maybe the adult kids moved back home with mom and dad. Shoot, maybe mom and dad moved in with the adult kids. We're just seeing different dynamics under the roof. And those social forces absolutely influence value. Examples of economic forces, trends in income and employment levels. If Amazon announces they're opening a warehouse, wherever their next location is, what do you think that does to the values in that area? It's going to increase them, isn't it? Because we got people that got to come in, they got jobs coming in. Flip that coin. What if Amazon announces they're going to shut their doors? They're going to close that plant. How does that affect our value? It brings it down the other way, doesn't it? Political forces, our government activity, zoning, taxes. Taxes absolutely can affect the value. Some counties just have higher taxes than others. And then environmental conditions. This is the proximity to things like public transportation, grocery stores, churches, schools, the places that we frequent. So all these things influence value. The appraisers, they're just studying for that specific property, but they're studying everything going around that specific property. We talk about you and I needing to be experts of our market. Same thing with the appraisers. They need to know the markets. They need to be familiar with the area. They need to know what's going on because that's going to affect that value. So there are some appraiser terms that we need to be familiar with. Highest and best use. Woo, we threw this one at you on day 1. Y'all remember this? Unit 1, day 1. Highest and best use. This is an appraiser tool. And they will always, when they're determining an appraised amount, they will always ask themselves, what is this property's current highest and best use? Maybe the property's maximizing their highest and best use. Maybe they're not. The appraiser doesn't care about that. What they're determining, what is the highest and best use? What would bring the most value? You can only have one highest and best use at a time, but that highest and best use can change. So as our infrastructure changes, as our cities grow, highest and best use can and does change. And again, the appraiser will always consider that. Substitution, I think of comparison shopping. The theory of substitution says when you have two items that are essentially the same, pretty much the same, naturally the consumer is going to go for the cheaper of the two. So again, put real estate aside. Maybe you've never bought a house before, but you have bought clothes before. You have bought something on Amazon, right? And you do some comparison shopping. And unless you see a benefit for paying more for that, whatever, typically consumers go towards the cheaper of the two items. Supply and demand is also something we introduce you to in Unit 1. Economics 101. When supply is up, demand is down. But when supply is down, demand is up. And as a real estate market, as a fluctuating real estate market, supply and demand is constantly changing. Now, real estate agents, brokers, we don't sit around talking about supply and demand. What we talk about is a buyer's market and a seller's market. Right now, we are still in a seller's market, not as strong of a seller's market as what we were, but we are still in a seller's market. Why are we in a seller's market? Because demand is high, supply is low. One day that pendulum is going to swing back. It was like way up here, and now it's probably like here. And one day it's going to swing back to a buyer's market. When's that going to happen? I don't know. A couple years, 10 years, I don't know. But when that does swing back, that pendulum does swing back to a buyer's market, what we're saying is supply is high and demand is low. Conformity, the appraisers feel that maximum value is reached when the property conforms or matches its surroundings. Now, I'm not saying those that don't match don't have value. We're saying is the maximum value is realized when the property matches, when it conforms. Have you ever been out Sunday afternoon, a nice Sunday afternoon drive, and you're in this 2-lane road in the middle of nowhere, you don't really know where you are? Today we have GPS to get us home, but you're just out cruising along, windows down, tunes up, and you go by little brick ranch house after little brick ranch house after little brick ranch house, and then you round the corner and bam, there's this monstrosity up on a hill that has like a 3-car garage and an in-ground pool and a fence and a gate code. And yeah, that thing doesn't conform. It doesn't match its surrounding areas. It's the sore thumb that kind of sticks out. Anticipation, some future benefit or detriment affects the value of the property. Maybe it's the truth, maybe it's rumors, but the anticipation of something coming can affect the value. Where are my Kernersville people? Do I have any Kernersville people? A couple of you? How long have they been talking about that daggone belt loop? Seriously, how long has that thing been? I mean, I showed up on the scene in the Triad in 2000, and they were talking about it then. We're just now able to drive on the thing. I mean, you know, you just don't wake up one day and say, I'm going to build a highway. I mean, it takes time and it's a process. But the anticipation of that thing coming has absolutely affected values in that area where it was projected to be. Contribution talks about how the improvement to any property can contribute to its overall value. Again, just because you put it in an in-ground pool doesn't mean you're going to get 100% rate of return. Not all buyers see the value in an in-ground pool. With contribution, I tend to think people can over-improve. They can over-improve. And again, I'm all about homeowners doing what they want while they live there. I'm all about it. It's your home. Do it. You just may not get that return. Your contribution may not help with the value. Competition. Let's go to our commercial. We don't talk too much about commercial. Do I have anybody going into commercial? Maybe, not sure. Let me get my license first, Julie, and then I'll think about it. I hear you. One thing at a time, right? All right, I hear you. So we don't talk too much about commercial in this class. You get a little bit more in post licensing. But bottom line, if you're going into commercial, it's a totally different beast than residential. And you need to make sure you connect with a good commercial agent. But competition, let's think about our retail centers, our retail stores, my Winston-Salem people. You don't have to be from Winston-Salem. But if you are, wherever you're from, you got some kind of retail center. My Winston-Salem people, let's talk about Thruway. The power of competition. If you go to Moe's tomorrow for lunch, what does Thruway want you to do after you eat lunch at Moe's? It wants you to go to Rack Room Shoes. It wants you to go to that fun little kitchen gadget store. It wants you to go to Dewey's and get a cake square, right? Once they get you there, they want the power of competition to keep you there. So that competition can bring in profits they can attract for each other. And with their parking lot and getting in and out, I might as well just stay until they close. It's just easier, especially around Christmas time. Oh my goodness. I don't eat Moe's at Christmas time. It's just too much. And then the last kind of appraiser term here is change. Part of the appraiser's job, they're going to study the past. That'll help them predict future changes. Is there a proposed zoning amendment on the table? And if that zoning amendment passes, how's it going to affect the value in that area? So they study the past to help better predict these future changes. Again, they too are the experts of their market. I would have, these look like good candidates to flashcards for me, have a basic understanding. I say, if you get a test question, they're going to give you a scenario and they're going to say which principle of value is the appraiser talking about, A, B, C, or D. So just a very basic understanding of the appraiser's terms. Starting to talk a little bit about the appraisal process. That starts on page 461. The appraiser is gathering two sets of data. Specific data is specific to the property. That one property that they're trying to determine value on. So what are the features of that property? How does that create value? General data then is looking about information about the neighborhood, the area. Again, what's our proximity to infrastructure, stores, churches, schools, libraries? What's the ease of getting there? That's the general data. You guys can look 461 over to 462, 463. You can kind of see the steps that an appraiser takes. This is just Green Star, which is why I didn't even create a slide for it. But I do think it might help to put this all together. If you just look that over, get that very basic understanding of what the appraiser is looking for. And what I want you to do, and this is another one, I got to get my readers back out, but I want you guys to turn with me in the book. The next page, new book people, you're on 464. Old book people, you are right after the steps that the appraiser takes. It's figure 17.1. And what we're looking at here is a sample appraisal, excuse me. So it's what we're getting when we get that appraisal. Do you guys see? And I know it's so hard to see, But do you guys see on the left-hand side, there's a black bar on the left-hand side? If you were to magnify that, there's words written in that left-hand bar. So it tells us the different categories of the appraisal. So there's subject, contract, neighborhood, site improvements, etc. I want you to flip back a page to page 463. Subject, neighborhood, site, description of improvement. That's what's on that black bar. So it's going to be easier to see on 463 with a little bit of description. The second page of our sample appraisal, we got the sales comparison approach, which is where we're going to start on Thursday, talking about the sales comparison approach. That's the appraiser's approach to value that's the most close to our CMA and BPO. Also on that second page, you have the reconciliation. That's the appraiser's finding. That's what their opinion of value is. So the very last thing on that second page of the appraisal, it has a price of $265,000 as of 8/25/2016. That is what the lender's looking for. That last thing under the reconciliation, that price there, is what the lender knows, so they know what to determine that loan to value ratio. Everything else on here is just what they did to get to that one price. Turn again to the last page of the appraisal, the sample appraisal. There's some additional comments, the appraiser's thoughts and opinions. The cost approach to value is another approach that we'll talk about on Thursday night. And then the income capitalization approach is the third. So we're going to talk about those, when the appraiser might use them, when they might consider them. And again, we get to pick up our calculators and do very basic understanding of how they get to this number. Questions so far? Guys, we've had a big night and we're at a really good stopping place. So I think I'm going to call it here. Give you a couple extra minutes tonight to do what it is that you do. So Thursday, we're going to Kahoot. We're going to do our financing Kahoot units 14, 15, and 21. And then we're going to pick up in 17, talk about the sales comparison approach, talk about the cost approach, talk about the income capitalization approach, and then we'll kind of talk about the broker's role in all this to determine not value. Remember, I need you guys as brokers to take that word value out of your vocabulary. That's only a word that licensed appraisers can use. So make sure you're saying probable sales price. So we'll go through that. We'll finish 17 on Thursday. As mentioned, we'll blow through 13 in like no time. And then we'll probably get started on unit 21. So we just keep going. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, you guys have a good day tomorrow. Everybody be safe. Get out there and get some sunshine if you can. And we'll do it again on Thursday. Let's see. Fabio. It is, where's he at?